They say the American dream was built on iron rails and piles of gold, but they lied. In 1860, the frontier didn't belong to the brave. It belonged to the titans, to the men who owned the steel, and the souls who shoveled the coal. Until a nobody from 5 Points built a miracle out of scrap metal, a machine that didn't just crawl, it leaped. This is the 3,000-mile race against an empire. This is the legend of the Iron Grasshopper. Buckle up, because we're about to jump over the world.
The autumn of 1860 didn't arrive in New York City with the scent of crisp apples or the sight of golden leaves. In the 5 Points, the city's most notorious slum, autumn arrived as a biting, humid chill that clung to the cobblestones like a wet shroud. It brought a wind that didn't just blow, it howled through the narrow, jagged alleys, carrying the suffocating perfume of the Industrial Revolution, a thick, oily mix of unrefined coal smoke, rotting harbor refuse, and the metallic tang of 1,000 overworked furnaces. In this world, the sky was a memory. A permanent ceiling of slate-gray smog sat heavy over the tenements, punctuated only by the skeletal fingers of brick chimneys belching black soot into the lungs of the poor. New York was a beast of iron and steam, a creature that never slept and never pitied. And at the heart of this beast's belly, tucked behind the soot-blackened walls of the Grand Central rail yards, lived Jack. Jack was 19, though the deep creases around his eyes, etched there by years of squinting through weld sparks, made him look like a man who had already seen the end of the century. He sat hunched beneath a lean-to fashioned from rusted corrugated tin and waterlogged timber. His face was a map of his labor, perpetually smudged with layers of graphite, oil, and the fine dust of ground iron. Yet, when he looked up, his eyes remained a startling, piercing blue, the color of a clear sky he hadn't seen in years. He was a ghost in the machinery of the city, an orphan of the yards. Jack had spent his childhood scavenging for dropped bolts and discarded copper wiring. By day, he slaved away in the scullery of a low-rent tavern, plunging his hands into scalding, greasy water for 14 hours a day just to earn a few copper cents and the right to sleep in the dirt. But by night, Jack was a creator. He was a scientist of the gutter. "Easy, Big Blue, just one more tension bolt," Jack whispered. His voice was raspy from years of inhaling coal dust. Beside him, a blue hound with ears so long they brushed the muddy earth let out a low, vibrating woof. Big Blue was as much a part of the yards as the iron itself. His coat was the color of a storm cloud, and his nose was so keen he could smell a hairline fracture in a steel beam from 50 paces away. He was Jack's only confidant, the only living soul who knew the secret hidden beneath the heavy, oil-stained canvas in the center of the shack. Jack stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. He reached for his most prized possession, a leather-bound notebook he'd rescued from a trash heap behind the Union Pacific headquarters years ago. Its pages were swollen with moisture and stained with coffee, but they were filled with something far more valuable than ledger entries. They were filled with the blueprints of a rebellion. He pulled back the tarp. There it sat, the Iron Grasshopper. It was a machine that defied every convention of the era. While the great engineers of the North were building massive, lumbering steam engines that required perfectly leveled iron rails to move, Jack had built something else.
The Grasshopper was a teardrop-shaped vessel of hammered scrap metal, its hull reinforced with ribs of reclaimed oak and brass piping, but its true marvel lay in its undercarriage. Instead of simple wheels, it possessed 4 massive, articulated legs powered by high-tension industrial springs and a revolutionary dual-piston steam drive. "They think the rails are the only way, Blue," Jack said, his fingers tracing a weld seam he'd spent 3 nights perfecting. The machine was a mosaic of American grit. The main boiler was a salvaged pressure cooker from a sunken steamboat on the Hudson. The springs were industrial-grade coils meant for a textile mill, which Jack had spent months recalibrating by hand. The control levers were whittled from hickory and tipped with the ivory keys of a discarded piano. Every bolt had been tightened with a prayer. Every gear had been polished with a dream of escaping the soot. Suddenly, the silence of the yard was shattered. A massive, bone-shaking whistle blast erupted from the station, followed by the frantic tolling of the city's bells. Jack stiffened. He knew that sound. It wasn't the regular arrival of the 6:05 express. It was a summons. He grabbed his tattered coat and sprinted towards the station, Big Blue galloping at his heels. As they emerged into the main square, a sea of people had already gathered. Men in top hats and waistcoats stood shoulder to shoulder with dock workers in wool caps. In the center of the square, on a raised wooden dais, a government official stood with a scroll of parchment. "Citizens, pioneers, by order of the President, the expansion to the west is stalled, the terrain is treacherous, and the mail is slow. We need a hero. We need a miracle." The crowd went silent. Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "A prize of 10,000 gold bars and the exclusive deed to the Western Railroad concession. All to the soul who can deliver this dispatch from New York to San Francisco in 30 days or less." A low murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. San Francisco in 30 days? It was a suicide mission. The Rockies were a wall of ice. The plains were a graveyard of broken axles. Then the ground began to vibrate with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Emerging from the steam of the main shed was the Black Monster. It was a titan of industry, a coal-black locomotive plated in reinforced steel, bristling with spikes and roaring with the power of 1,000 horses. At the helm stood Baron Steele, a man whose mustache was as sharp as his business tactics and whose heart was rumored to be made of cold anthracite. 10,000 gold bars? Baron sneered, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Consider them already in my vault. I have the coal, I have the steel, and I have the rails. Who would dare challenge me? Who among you has anything but a death wish?" The crowd lowered their heads. The Baron's power was absolute. But then a small rattling sound broke the tension. Clank, siss, boing. From the shadows of the back alley, a strange rust-colored shape limped into the light. It was Jack, perched atop the Iron Grasshopper. The machine hissed steam from its joints, and its legs moved with an awkward staccato rhythm that made the wealthy spectators burst into laughter. "I'll take that bet, Baron," Jack shouted, his voice cracking but holding firm. Baron Steele looked down from his high iron perch, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You, the dish scrubber? You think that pile of junk can outrun a monster?" "It's not junk," a new voice rang out. A woman stepped out from the crowd, wearing grease-stained overalls and a belt full of heavy wrenches. She had a long, modified rifle slung over her back and eyes that looked like they'd seen every corner of the frontier. "The name's Maggie," she said, looking at Jack with a nod of approval. "I've spent 10 years in the circus and 5 in the mines. I can calculate a trajectory while a train is derailing, and I can fix a boiler with a hairpin and a piece of gum. You've got the legs, kid. I've got the map, and the Baron, he's just got a big mouth. The square erupted. Some cheered, most laughed, but the challenge was set. Jack looked at the horizon, a horizon he had only ever seen in his drawings. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the unknown. "Ready, Blue?" Jack whispered. The dog barked, a sound of pure defiance. "Then let's go jump over the world."
The starting gun didn't just fire. It cracked the morning air like a lightning strike. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the Manhattan tenements, the black monster surged forward. Its massive drive wheels spun against the iron rails, shrieking in a shower of white-hot sparks before finally catching traction. Baron Steele's locomotive was a vision of terrifying efficiency, 1,000 tons of black iron and coal fire, belching a column of smoke so thick it momentarily turned the morning into midnight. Within seconds, the Baron was a diminishing shadow, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of sulfur and the mocking echoes of his steam whistle. Back at the starting line, the Iron Grasshopper shuddered. "Pressure's erratic! Jack, the seals on the primary cylinder are weeping!" Maggie shouted over the hiss of escaping steam. She was already halfway out of the cockpit, her boots braced against the brass railing as she hammered a stubborn valve into place with the butt of her heavy wrench. Jack gripped the hickory control levers until his knuckles turned as white as the steam. "She's just nervous, Maggie. She's never had this much heat in her belly before." He slammed his foot down on the pedal. Hiss, clank, thud. The Grasshopper didn't roll, it lunged. The massive iron springs in the rear legs compressed with a groan of tortured metal and then released, propelling the teardrop-shaped vessel forward in a staggering 20-foot bound. The crowd, which had been jeering only moments ago, fell into a stunned silence. They watched as the rust-colored machine skipped across the cobblestones, its 4 legs moving in a rhythmic, insect-like dance that defied the laws of grace and gravity. "We're moving, Blue! We're actually moving!" Jack yelled. Big Blue let out a howl of pure adrenaline, his ears flapping wildly in the wind as they cleared the city limits and headed for the dark, rising silhouette of the Appalachian Mountains. By the 3rd day, the excitement of the start had been replaced by the grueling reality of the frontier. The lush, rolling hills of Pennsylvania had turned into steep, jagged inclines. The air grew thin and cold, and the smell of pine needles was constantly fighting with the scent of hot oil. "He's playing dirty, Jack," Maggie muttered, peering through her brass telescope. "Look at the tracks up ahead." Baron Steele had used his lead to sabotage the path. Huge piles of timber and boulders had been shoved onto the narrow mountain passes. Even worse, the Baron's track layers had greased the inclines with thick lard, making it impossible for any standard train to gain purchase. But the Grasshopper wasn't a standard train. "We don't need the tracks where we're going," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. He pulled a secondary lever, shifting the power from the wheels to the jumping struts. "Maggie, check the incline. Can we clear that ridge?" Maggie quickly pulled out a slide rule, her fingers moving with the speed of a card shark. "Wind is coming from the northwest at 12 knots. The slope is 42 degrees. If you hit the steam release at exactly 3,000 pounds, we'll clear the trees. If you're off by a second, we're going to be a very expensive smear on that granite wall." "I like those odds," Jack grinned. As they reached the base of the greased incline, the Grasshopper slowed. The world around them was a blur of ancient oaks and limestone cliffs. Jack waited, his hand hovering over the red-painted leap valve. The boiler was screaming now, the needle on the gauge vibrating deep into the red zone. "Now!" screamed Maggie. Jack yanked the lever. The sound was like a cannon blast. The Iron Grasshopper didn't just jump, it took flight. For 5 long, heart-stopping seconds, they were airborne. Jack felt his stomach drop as he looked out the side window and saw the tops of 100-foot pine trees passing beneath them. They were soaring over the obstacles, over the grease, and over the limitations of the old world.
They landed with a bone-jarring thum on the other side of the ridge, skidding across the dirt until the legs dug in and stabilized the craft. "Whew!" Maggie pumped her fist in the air, but her celebration was cut short. A sharp ping sounded from the rear. "Jack, the landing was too hard. We've snapped a tension cable on the starboard leg. We're hobbled." Jack climbed out of the pilot's seat, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. They were high up now, the valley below shrouded in a sea of mist. In the distance, he could see the faint, rhythmic glow of the black monster's firebox crawling along the valley floor like a glowing ember. "We fix it," Jack said firmly, grabbing a coil of steel wire. "We fix it and we keep going, because the Baron thinks he's won. He thinks he's left us in the dust." Maggie looked at the kid, really looked at him. His face was covered in a fresh layer of soot, and his hands were bleeding from the rough handling of the controls, but his eyes were still that impossible burning blue. She realized then that they weren't just racing for gold. They were racing to prove that the world belonged to the dreamers, who weren't afraid to break their hearts on a pile of scrap metal. "All right, kid," she said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Pass me the torch. Let's show this mountain what a couple of nobodies can do." As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the wilderness, the sound of a hammer hitting iron rang out through the forest, a steady, defiant heartbeat in the dark.
The transition from the jagged, claustrophobic peaks of the Appalachians to the rolling expanse of the Midwest was like stepping out of a cellar into a cathedral. The horizon retreated until it was a vast, unbroken line where the golden-brown prairie met an endless sky. But by the time the Iron Grasshopper crossed into Kansas on the 14th day, that sky had turned a sickly, bruised shade of indigo. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping faster than a lead weight in a pond," Maggie noted, her eyes glued to a brass barometer that was beginning to hum with a strange, high-pitched vibration. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of black grease across her brow. "The air is too still, Jack. It's the kind of quiet that precedes a funeral." Jack didn't look away from the path ahead. The Grasshopper was currently in ground skim mode, its legs working in a low, rapid gallop that kept them moving at a steady 30 miles per hour. The limping rabbit engine was humming a smoother tune now, thanks to Maggie's constant tinkering and a few choice drops of fine clock oil they'd traded for in Ohio. "Look!" Jack pointed toward the horizon. In the distance, the black monster was visible. Baron Steele's train was a dark, jagged silhouette against the eerie green light of the afternoon. It looked like a wounded beast, its massive wheels churning up clouds of dust as it raced toward a line of coal water tanks. But Baron wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at the clouds. Suddenly, the stillness broke. A low, guttural moan rose from the earth, a sound so deep it vibrated in Jack's teeth. On the horizon, the clouds began to churn like a boiling pot. A finger of darkness dropped from the sky, thin and elegant at first, then thickening into a massive, debris-choked column of destruction. Then a second one appeared right beside it. "Tornadoes," Maggie whispered, her voice uncharacteristically small. "Twin sisters, and they're sitting right on the tracks." Through her spyglass, she saw the black monster shudder to a halt. Even a titan of steel couldn't stand against winds that could peel the skin off the earth. Baron Steele's men were frantically hammering massive iron spikes into the ground, tethering the locomotive to the planet itself in a desperate bid to survive. "He's stopping," Jack said, his voice tight. "If he stops and we stop, the deadline dies. We'll never make the coast in time." "Jack, you can't be serious," Maggie said, turning to him. "Those winds are clocked at over 200 miles per hour. If we get caught in that vortex, the Grasshopper will be nothing but confetti made of tin and bone." Jack looked at Big Blue. The hound was standing on his hind legs, his nose pressed against the glass, his tail tucked but his eyes alert.
Then Jack looked at the blueprints pinned to the dashboard. He'd designed the hull for aerodynamics, inspired by the way a raindrop falls. "Maggie, remember the circus?" Jack asked, his hand hovering over the aero vane controls. "The high wire acts? They don't fight the wind. They use the sway to find their balance." "This isn't a tightrope, Jack. This is a meat grinder." "We aren't going to fight it," Jack said, his blue eyes flashing with a terrifying brilliance. "We're going to hitch a ride. We have the springs. We have the light frame. If we hit the outer rim of the updraft and deploy the vanes, we can slingshot around the core." Maggie stared at him for a heartbeat, her mind racing through the physics. She saw the madness in it, but she also saw the math. "You're going to use the centrifugal force of a Category 5 storm to throw us across the state? Do you have a better idea?" Maggie let out a sharp, hysterical laugh and tightened her goggles. "Lock the secondary hatches. Blue, get under the seat. Jack, if we die, I'm going to haunt you for the rest of eternity." Jack slammed the throttle forward. The Iron Grasshopper screamed as the boiler pressure spiked. As they neared the first tornado, the world turned into a deafening roar. Gravity seemed to lose its grip. The car began to vibrate so violently that the piano key levers clattered like teeth. "Now! Deploy vanes!" Jack roared. Maggie yanked the secondary cords. Two curved metal fins flared out from the sides of the car. The wind caught them with the force of a tidal wave. The grasshopper was ripped from the ground, not with a jump, but with a violent spiraling lift. They were inside the green wall. Objects blurred past the windows, shattered barns, uprooted trees, and the terrifying sight of a farm wagon spinning in the air. Jack wrestled with the controls, his muscles screaming as he fought to keep the nose pointed outward. The G-force pressed them into their seats, making it hard to breathe. "Hold it! Hold it!" Jack hissed through gritted teeth. With a final gut-wrenching lurch, the grasshopper reached the outer edge of the vortex. Jack triggered the rear jumping struts. Boom! The release of the springs, combined with the momentum of the storm, acted like a giant rubber band. They were catapulted out of the darkness and into the clear, quiet air behind the storm. They sailed through the sky for what felt like miles, the prairie a golden blur beneath them, before finally descending in a long, terrifying arc. They hit the ground with a slide that lasted 100 yards, digging 2 deep furrows into the Kansas soil. Silence followed, a silence so profound it felt heavy. Jack slumped over the controls, his chest heaving. Maggie slowly sat up, her hair a wild nest of tangles, and checked her pocket watch. "We just covered 120 miles in 8 minutes, she whispered, her voice shaking. Behind them, the storm moved on, leaving a path of mown grass. Further back, still anchored to the ground and shrouded in dust, was the black monster. Baron Steele would be digging himself out for days. Jack looked at his hands. They were shaking, but they were the hands of a man who had just outrun a god. "Halfway there, Maggie," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "Next stop, the Rockies." Big Blue poked his head out from under the seat and let out a single triumphant bark. The Iron Grasshopper, battered and scorched but very much alive, stood up on its spindly legs and began to walk westward once more.
The transition from the scorched plains of Kansas to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains was a descent into a world of jagged teeth and frozen silence. By the 23rd day, the air had grown so thin it felt like breathing powdered glass. The sky, stripped of its Kansas emerald, was now a cold, indifferent crystalline blue. "The mercury in the thermometer just gave up and retreated into the bulb," Maggie said, her breath blooming in thick, white plumes. She was wrapped in 3 layers of wool and a scavenged bear pelt, her fingers trembling as she tried to apply a coat of heavy lard to the exposed gears. "The iron is getting brittle, Jack. If we hit a rock too hard, the legs won't jump. They'll shatter like glass." Jack was hunched over the boiler, his face mere inches from the firebox to catch whatever warmth he could. The limping rabbit was wheezing, a wet rhythmic cough that signaled the buildup of ice in the intake valves. Every joint of the Iron Grasshopper groaned in protest, the metal contracting in the sub-zero temperatures. "We have to keep the steam moving," Jack replied, his voice raspy. "If the water in the pipes freezes, the boiler becomes a bomb." They were navigating a narrow, treacherous ledge known as the Devil's Backbone. To their left was a vertical wall of granite, to their right a 1,000-foot drop into a gorge filled with mist and jagged pines. Suddenly, Big Blue stood up, his fur bristling. He didn't bark, he let out a low, mournful whine, his nose pointing toward a dark opening in the mountainside, the entrance to a deep-shaft silver mine. A rhythmic, frantic clanging echoed from the darkness of the mine. "Jack, stop!" Maggie whispered. As the grasshopper hissed to a halt, they saw it. A massive avalanche had recently swept down the peak, burying the mine's entrance under 20 feet of packed snow and shattered timber. Faint voices, muffled, desperate screams drifted through the cracks in the debris. "There are people in there," Jack said, his blue eyes widening. Just then, a thunderous roar filled the canyon. Around the bend of the lower pass, the black monster appeared. Baron Steele had managed to repair his locomotive, though it looked scarred and battered from the Kansas storm. The Baron didn't slow down. He leaned out of his heated, velvet-lined cab, a look of manic obsession on his face. "Move that rust bucket out of my way, boy," Baron screamed, his voice amplified by a brass megaphone. "I've got a schedule to keep and a kingdom to win." "Baron, wait!" Jack shouted, pointing to the buried mine. "There are miners trapped. We need your winch and your heat sinks to clear the ice." Baron Steele let out a cold, sharp laugh that was swallowed by the mountain wind. "Time is gold, and gold waits for no saint. If they wanted to live, they shouldn't have been born poor." He slammed the throttle, and the black monster surged past, its massive weight causing the ledge to vibrate dangerously. He left them in a cloud of freezing soot, disappearing into the upper tunnel toward the summit. Jack stood frozen for a second, his gaze flickering between the retreating taillights of the Baron and the silent, buried tomb of the miners. "We have 7 days left, Jack," Maggie said softly, her hand resting on the leap lever. "If we stop to dig them out, the Baron wins. We lose the gold. We lose the concession. We go back to the 5 Points and wash dishes until we die." Jack looked at the buried entrance. He thought of his father, dying in a cold tenement because no one would stop to help a man without a surname. He looked at his calloused, grease-stained hands. "I didn't build this machine to be like him. I built it to be better." He didn't wait for an answer. He began rerouting the high-pressure steam lines from the legs to the front-mounted auxiliary vents. "Maggie, I need you to bypass the safety governors. We're going to turn the Grasshopper into a furnace." For the next 6 hours, they fought a war against the ice. Jack directed the scorching, high-pressure steam directly at the avalanche debris, the white mist swallowing the car. Maggie worked alongside him, using her grappling hook to drag away shattered timbers. Jack's body was a map of exhaustion. His muscles screamed, and his vision blurred from the heat and the cold. Finally, with a thunderous crack, the last shelf of ice gave way. A dozen miners, pale and shivering, but alive, stumbled out into the twilight. Among them was an elderly Chinese engineer with a long silver braid, clutching a small, ornate jade vial. He walked up to Jack, his eyes wet with tears, and pressed the vial into his hand. "This is snow lotus oil, my ancestors' secret. It does not freeze, it does not burn, it makes the iron move like water." By the time the miners were safe, the sun had long since set. They had lost nearly 12 hours. The black monster was likely miles ahead, nearing the California border. Jack applied the snow lotus oil to the seizing joints of the Grasshopper.
The effect was instantaneous. The machine seemed to sigh in relief, the metal becoming supple and silent. Jack climbed back into the seat, a new fire in his eyes. "We're behind," Jack said, his hand on the throttle. "Then I guess we'll just have to jump higher," Maggie replied, her grin returning. With a surge of power they had never felt before, the Iron Grasshopper lunged forward. It didn't just crawl up the mountain, it danced. They scaled frozen waterfalls and leapt over chasms that would have stopped any other vehicle. Below them, the world was a sea of clouds. Above them, the stars were so bright they looked like sparks from a cosmic forge.
The 29th day dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum. As the Iron Grasshopper crossed the Sierra Nevada, the air finally began to warm, carrying the faint, salty promise of the Pacific. But the journey was far from over. Ahead lay the Great Sierra Gorge, a 300-foot-wide wound in the earth that was the final gate to San Francisco. 20 hours left on the clock, Maggie muttered, her eyes bloodshot as she checked the chronometer. If we hit the coast by noon tomorrow, we win. If not, we're just two more fools who died in the dirt. Jack didn't answer. He was focused on the horizon. There, perched on the edge of the gorge, was the black monster. But it wasn't moving. As they drew closer, the horrifying reality became clear. The massive wooden trestle bridge that once spanned the abyss was gone. It lay in a shattered, smoldering heap at the bottom of the canyon. Baron Steele stood on the precipice, holding a smoking detonator. His men were busy preparing a private steam ferry at a lower river crossing, a process that would take hours Jack didn't have. "You're late, boy," Baron yelled across the chasm, his voice carried by the wind. "If I can't have the bridge, no one can. I'll reach the city hall by ferry, and you'll stay here and rust." The Baron's laughter was drowned out by the roar of the river 1,000 feet below. Jack pulled the Iron Grasshopper to a halt at the very edge of the broken rails. He looked down into the maw of the gorge. It was a distance that defied reason. "Maggie," Jack said, his voice eerily calm, "how much snow lotus oil is left?" Maggie checked the vial. 6 drops, just enough to prime the main compression chambers for one massive burst. But Jack, look at that gap. It's over 300 feet. The springs weren't built for this. The hull will crumple on impact even if we make it. Jack turned to her. The soot on his face couldn't hide the absolute clarity in his blue eyes. This machine was built from things people threw away. It was built from the dreams of people who weren't supposed to have them. If we don't take this jump, we prove the Baron right. We prove that the world only belongs to the people who can afford the bridge. Maggie looked at the gorge, then at the dog, and finally back at the boy from 5 Points. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her slide rule, and snapped it in half. Calculate the trajectory? To hell with the math. Let's give 'em a show. She poured the final drops of the ancient oil into the secondary injectors. Jack slammed the boiler door shut. "Blue, get in the back and hold on to the oak ribs. Maggie, lock the pressure valves. We're going to dump every ounce of steam into the struts at the exact same moment." The Iron Grasshopper began to glow. The snow lotus oil reacted with the heat, turning the steam into a vibrant, shimmering cobalt blue. The limping rabbit engine didn't cough anymore. It roared with a sound like 1,000 trumpets. Jack backed the car up 1/2 mile, the legs digging deep furrows into the California soil. He took a deep breath, smelling the grease, the oil, and the salt air. Now! The Iron Grasshopper charged. It hit 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. The ground was a blur. The edge of the cliff rushed towards them like a closing door. At the final inch of solid earth, Jack yanked the eternity lever. Boom! The sound was not an explosion, but a physical shockwave. The 4 colossal springs released with such force that the ground beneath them cracked.
The Iron Grasshopper didn't just leap, it was shot into the sky like a cannonball. For a moment, time stopped. They were suspended in the golden light of the setting sun, high above the clouds and the wreckage. Below them, Baron Steele looked up, his jaw dropping, his cigar falling from his mouth as he witnessed a miracle of scrap metal. The car cut through the air, its brass veins humming a song of defiance. Then, gravity reclaimed its prize. They hit the other side with a violence that shattered the front legs instantly. The hull screeched as it slammed into the dirt, sliding at a terrifying speed towards the city gates. The glass shattered, the oak ribs groaned, and the engine let out one final dying hiss of steam. The car came to a stop exactly 60 feet from the San Francisco City Hall. Silence fell over the plaza. A crowd of citizens who had been waiting for the great race to end stood frozen. The wreckage of the Iron Grasshopper lay smoking in the street. Slowly, the door groaned open. Jack crawled out, his clothes shredded, his face bleeding, but his hand was held high. In it was the president's letter, the seal still intact. He stumbled towards the official on the steps. New York to San Francisco, 29 days, 23 hours, and 59 seconds. As the official took the letter, the final bell of the clock tower began to toll. The city erupted. People didn't just cheer, they roared. They swarmed the wreckage, lifting Jack and Maggie onto their shoulders. Big Blue hopped out of the ruins, barking at the moon that was just beginning to rise over the Pacific. Baron Steele arrived by ferry 3 hours later to find a city that no longer feared him. His black monster was just a train, but the Iron Grasshopper was a legend. Jack didn't keep the gold for himself. He used the concession to build a new kind of railroad, one where the workers were partners, and where no child was ever told their dreams were too big for their surnames. He built a school in the heart of San Francisco, shaped like a teardrop, where the next generation of nobodies could learn to build wings from scrap. And in the center of the city park, they placed the remains of the Iron Grasshopper. It sat there for 100 years, a rusted, beautiful monument to the truth Jack had proven on that golden afternoon. That in the land of the free, you don't need a golden bridge to reach the horizon. You just need the courage to jump.